Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a quiet, often underestimated nation just brought one of the world's largest industrial titans to its knees using a weapon nobody saw coming? And what if the very strategy General Motors used to exploit Canada for decades became the exact mechanism that led to their most catastrophic financial miscalculation in modern history? Something extraordinary is happening inside North America's auto industry. A shift so profound that it is rewriting the economic textbooks on sovereignty, corporate power, and national leverage. For generations, the relationship between the Canadian government and the giants of Detroit, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, was defined by a predictable, almost ritualistic dynamic. The corporations held the capital, the jobs, and the future. The government held the checkbook, ready to pay whatever ransom was required to keep factories open. It was a relationship built on fear, the fear of capital flight, the fear of unemployment, and the fear that Canada, without American industry, would rust away. But the events of October 2025 shattered that dynamic forever. When General Motors decided to betray its commitments to Canadian workers by permanently shutting down the CAMI plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, they expected the usual response: angry speeches, political posturing, and eventually a quiet capitulation. Instead, they walked into a buzzsaw. This is the comprehensive story of how General Motors miscalculated a nation, how Minister Mélanie Joly and the Canadian government dropped the hammer, and how a technical policy known as the Auto Remission Framework turned a corporate betrayal into a panic that swept through the boardrooms of Detroit. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we must first examine the strategic miscalculation that set this entire crisis in motion. To understand the magnitude of the shock that hit General Motors, one must first understand the arrogance that precipitated it. General Motors is not just a car company. It is an institution that has, for over a century, operated with the weight of a sovereign state. In the boardrooms of Detroit, Canada has historically been viewed not as a partner of equals, but as a branch plant economy, a convenient extension of the American industrial machine, useful for its healthcare savings and skilled labor, but ultimately disposable when the ledger turns red. This mindset created a dangerous blind spot. The executives at GM believed that they could bend Canada to their will because, frankly, they always had. The historical precedent was clear. If a government pushed too hard on regulations, the company threatened to move to Mexico or the American South. If a union demanded too much, the company threatened closure. It was a game of chicken where the corporation was driving a tank and the government was riding a bicycle. GM believed that 2025 would be no different. They believed that the Canadian government, facing economic headwinds and political division, would be too weak to challenge a corporation with the size, history, and political influence of General Motors. They misread everything. They misread the workers who built their vehicles, believing their loyalty could be exploited indefinitely. They misread the economic storm that would hit them when they decided to walk away from a G7 nation. But most fatally, they misread Ottawa. They assumed they were dealing with the Canada of 10 years ago, a polite neighbor happy to accept scraps. They failed to notice that a new philosophy had taken root in the halls of Canadian power, a philosophy driven by a new understanding of sovereignty and leverage. General Motors thought Canada would stay quiet. They thought the people they abandoned would suffer in silence, invisible statistics in a quarterly report. They were wrong. This wasn't just a business decision, it was a test of national will. And when GM pushed, expecting Canada to fold, they found themselves pushing against a wall of steel. But this story isn't just about corporate strategy. It is rooted in a deep and painful sense of betrayal. The roots of this confrontation stretch back to 2022, a year defined by optimism and grand promises. It was the height of the electric vehicle hype cycle, and General Motors came to Canada with a vision. They pitched the Bright Drop program, an electric delivery van that would revolutionize logistics, as the future of the CAMI plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. This wasn't marketed as a temporary project or a stopgap measure. It was sold to the Canadian public as a generational investment, a cornerstone of the new green economy. The narrative was intoxicating. Ingersoll would not just be building cars, it would be building the future. Based on these commitments, the provincial government of Ontario and the federal government in Ottawa opened the public coffers. Billions of dollars in subsidies, loans, and infrastructure investments were poured into GM's operations. This money was not a gift, it was a contract. It was a down payment on stability, meant to secure jobs for the 1,200 workers at the plant and economic security for the thousands of families in the surrounding community. For a while, the promise seemed real. But the reality of the auto industry is often colder than its press releases. By April 2025, the tone had shifted. Citing weak demand and market adjustments, General Motors suspended production at the CAMI plant. At the time, they assured the union, Unifor, and the government that this was a temporary pause, a standard retooling period common in the industry. The workers trusted them. Why wouldn't they? These were men and women who had given decades of their lives to the company. They had weathered recessions, supply chain shocks, and global downturns, always sticking by the company that formed the backbone of their town. They tightened their belts, dipped into savings, and waited for the recall notice. May came and went. The plant remained dark. Summer faded into fall, and the silence from Detroit grew deafening. There was no guidance, no updates, no clarity. The anxiety in Ingersoll transformed into dread. Families began to wonder if the temporary pause was a lie. Then, on October 21st, 2025, the hammer dropped, but it dropped on the workers first. General Motors announced that the CAMI facility was not restarting. The closure was permanent. There was no transition plan, no new model allocation, no soft landing. The bright drop dream was dead, and 200 careers were extinguished with the stroke of a pen. The cruelty of the decision lay in its timing and its suddenness. GM had accepted every subsidy, every tax break, and every ounce of goodwill, only to walk away the moment it suited their bottom line. They treated the billions in public support not as a binding commitment to the country, but as a parachute for themselves. For the community of Ingersoll, this was not a corporate restructuring, it was a catastrophe. Imagine being a single mother with 12 years on the line. Every shift, every overtime hour, every missed weekend with the kids was an investment in a pension and a future. GM wasn't just an employer, it was the foundation of her life. When the announcement hit, that foundation crumbled. Inflation was making groceries unbearable, rent was high, and suddenly the paycheck was gone. This is the part of the story that analysts often gloss over, focusing on stock prices and margins, but the betrayal of the social contract is what fueled the fire that was about to consume GM. The company believed they could sever the lifeline of a town and simply move on. They didn't realize that, in doing so, they had handed the Canadian government the moral and political ammunition to launch a counterattack unprecedented in North American history. And this is where the narrative shifts, because this is the moment the government decided to drop the hammer. In the days following the October 21st announcement, the atmosphere in Ottawa was deceptively calm. There were no frantic press conferences or panicked meetings. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like the government was paralyzed. In reality, they were loading a weapon. Ministers Mélanie Joly and François-Philippe Champagne knew that a traditional political response, shaming the company and the media, would be ignored. Corporate giants are immune to shame. They respond only to mathematics. If Canada wanted to punish GM, they had to make the betrayal more expensive than the loyalty. 3 days after the closure announcement, the silence broke. Joly and Champagne issued a joint statement. It was short, sterile, and lacked the diplomatic varnish usually found in international trade disputes. It read simply that the decisions of General Motors and Stellantis go against their commitments to Canada and Canadian workers. To the public, it sounded like a rebuke. To the lawyers in Detroit, it sounded like a gunshot. The government was activating the Auto Remission Framework. This is a technical, bureaucratic-sounding policy mechanism that is, in practice, a lethal economic guillotine. The framework operates on a simple principle of quid pro quo. If you manufacture vehicles in Canada, you are granted the privilege of importing vehicles from your US and Mexican plants duty-free. It is a reward for investment. However, the inverse is also true. If you cease to manufacture in Canada, if you break the chain of production, you lose the privilege of duty-free importation. Ottawa didn't just threaten to use this tool, they executed it with surgical precision. The government announced that General Motors' duty-free import quota was being cut by exactly 24.2%. That specific number was not random. It was calculated to correspond precisely with the production volume lost in Ingersoll. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Before this decision, a Chevrolet Silverado or a GMC Sierra built in Michigan could cross the Ambassador Bridge into Windsor, Ontario, without penalty. Under the new enforcement, once GM hit its reduced quota, every single vehicle crossing that border would be slapped with a 25% retaliatory tariff. The math was brutal. A truck that cost $60,000 was suddenly $75,000. A family SUV that was competitively priced at $45,000 ballooned to $56,000. Overnight, GM's entire pricing model for the Canadian market, one of its largest and most profitable markets, evaporated. But GM wasn't the only target. Stellantis, the parent company of Jeep and Chrysler, had also been playing fast and loose with Canadian commitments, shifting Jeep production to Illinois. Ottawa applied the same logic to them, slashing their duty-free privileges by up to 50%. This was the hammer. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a protest. It was a structural, non-negotiable adjustment of the ledger. Canada essentially declared, you broke the contract. Now you pay the full price. I want to pause here and ask you a question. Do you think the Canadian government was right to use such a heavy hand, or do you think this sets a dangerous precedent for future business relations? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I am really curious to see where you stand on this. With the economic weapon effectively deployed, the government then moved to deliver the ultimate ultimatum. If the tariffs were the punch, the follow-up was the knockout. Melanie Joly, often underestimated by the old boys club of industrial manufacturing, demonstrated a resolve that shocked the industry. She didn't wait for GM to come begging for relief. She went on the offensive. Joly's team dispatched official legal letters to the headquarters of GM and Stellantis. These were not invitations to negotiate. They were notices of noncompliance. The letter to Stellantis warned that their commitments were legally binding and that the government was prepared to claw back funding, meaning they would force the company to repay the subsidies they had already spent. For General Motors, the message was even more direct. Joly issued an ultimatum. GM had 15 days. 15 days. Not 6 months to conduct a feasibility study, not a year to consult with shareholders. 15 days to present a concrete, binding plan to restart production at the CAMI plant. The government demanded specifics. They didn't want a concept or a vision. They demanded a new vehicle allocation, firm production timelines, and guaranteed job numbers. If GM failed to meet this deadline, the 24.2% quota reduction and the resulting 25% tariffs would become permanent. This move fundamentally shifted the negotiation table. In the past, auto executives would summon government officials to Detroit to dictate terms. Now, the executives were being summoned. Joly convened meetings that included not just the corporate leadership, but the workers themselves. Unifor representatives were at the table. The message delivered in those closed-door meetings was described by insiders as brutal. There was no evasion allowed, no public relations spin. When GM executives tried to explain the global market conditions, they were cut off and reminded of the contract. Restore the commitments, or face the consequences. For the first time in decades, Ottawa was in the driver's seat. The 15-day clock was ticking, and with every passing hour, GM was bleeding money. The psychological impact of this ultimatum cannot be overstated. It stripped the corporation of its greatest weapon, time. Usually, a corporation can outweigh a government. They can delay until an election cycle changes the players or until the public loses interest. But by attaching an immediate financial penalty to the deadline, Joly ensured that GM couldn't afford to wait. The immediate result of these calculated actions was nothing short of fallout and panic within the industry. The reaction in Detroit was not just concern, it was absolute panic. General Motors had underestimated how rapidly costs could explode in a connected North American economy. The panic started in the finance departments. Analysts at GM HQ ran the simulations and realized the company was facing a mathematical impossibility. The Canadian market is not a niche market. It is integral to the volume required to keep U.S. plants profitable. If GM effectively lost the Canadian market due to a 25% price disadvantage, production at U.S. plants would have to be cut, leading to inefficiencies south of the border. Then, the panic spread to the dealerships. In border states like Michigan, Ohio, and New York, and across the Canadian provinces, dealerships were thrust into chaos. A GM dealer in Toronto suddenly found themselves trying to sell inventory that was $10,000 to $15,000 more expensive than a comparable Ford or Toyota. Customers walked onto the lot, saw the sticker shock, and walked right across the street to a competitor. Inventory began to gather dust. Sales managers were calling headquarters, screaming for answers. How are we supposed to sell these cars, they asked. European competitors, who were honoring their trade agreements, faced none of these penalties. Japanese manufacturers continued business as usual. GM was alone on an island of its own making. The inventory crisis highlighted the interconnected nature of the betrayal. GM thought they were just closing a factory in Canada. They didn't realize they were torpedoing their own sales network. The panic was not contained to GM. The shockwaves hit the entire industry. Ford executives, watching the carnage, immediately paused their own strategic reviews. They realized that the rules of the game had changed. If Canada was willing to pull the trigger on GM, they would certainly do it to Ford. Stellantis, arguably in a worse position due to the 50% cut, went into full damage control mode. In a move that signaled deep internal turmoil, they quietly replaced their Canadian CEO. It was a sacrificial offering, an admission that their previous strategy of bullying Ottawa had failed spectacularly. Meanwhile, back at GM, the math began to tell a clear story. The cost of weathering permanent tariffs was astronomically higher than the cost of retooling the Ingersoll plant. It was a simple equation. Restarting the plant might cost $500 million, but losing the Canadian market could cost billions over the next decade. Within 3 weeks of the tariff announcement, the tone from Detroit changed. The arrogance evaporated. GM representatives reached out privately to the Ontario government. They asked, "What do we need to do to fix this?" This was the surrender. Corporations that once treated Canada as an afterthought were now asking for instructions. They were realizing that the Auto Remission Framework was not a bluff. It was a structural reality. However, the implications of this showdown extend far beyond the automotive sector, signaling a profound shift in the global business landscape. This confrontation is not happening in a vacuum. It is triggering a ripple effect that is being felt in boardrooms far removed from Detroit. What we are witnessing is the birth of a new doctrine of trade enforcement, one that prizes predictability over chaos and structure over emotion. To fully grasp the magnitude of this shift, consider the silent observers who are watching this drama unfold. The aerospace giants like Boeing, the semiconductor titans like Intel, and the global pharmaceutical conglomerates. These are industries that, much like the auto sector, have long operated on the assumption that government subsidies are free money, incentives with few strings attached. They are now waking up to a new reality where the strings are not only present, but are made of steel. For years, the global economy has been whipsawed by the unpredictable nature of trade wars, exemplified by the chaos strategy often associated with previous U.S. administrations. In those scenarios, tariffs were used as blunt instruments, often applied randomly and lifted just as capriciously. That unpredictability made long-term planning impossible for corporations. But what Canada has introduced with the Auto Remission Framework is something entirely different: the strategy of predictability. This strategy does not rely on the mood of a leader or the news cycle of the day. It relies on a simple binary logic. If you honor your commitments, the benefits flow. If you break them, the penalties activate automatically. This creates a paradox that corporations are struggling to reconcile. On one hand, businesses despise regulation. On the other hand, they crave certainty. By enforcing strict, non-negotiable consequences, Canada has ironically made itself a more stable environment for serious capital. Companies that intend to stay and build can now look at Canada and see a partner that plays by a fixed set of rules. Conversely, predatory capital, and companies looking to extract subsidies and flee, now views Canada as a high-risk jurisdiction. This filtering effect is intentional. It signals to the world that Canada is no longer interested in being a low-cost, low-commitment jurisdiction. It is positioning itself as a premium partner for long-term industrial building. Consider the pharmaceutical sector, which frequently negotiates massive public funding packages for research and development facilities. In the wake of the GM crackdown, legal teams at these major firms are undoubtedly reviewing their own agreements with the Canadian government. The precedent has been set. Clawbacks are real. If a pharma giant takes public money to build a lab in Montreal and then decides to move operations to Ireland 3 years later, they now know that the Canadian government has the will and the mechanism to recover that investment. The era of take the money and run has effectively been legislated out of existence. Furthermore, this standoff serves as a critical prelude to the upcoming review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. By demonstrating that it has sovereign levers outside of the treaty, domestic policies like the remission framework that technically comply with trade rules while enforcing domestic interests, Canada is strengthening its hand for future negotiations. It proves that the country is not merely a passive signatory to American-led deals, but an active architect of its own economic destiny. The message to Washington is just as clear as the message to Detroit. Canada is a sophisticated operator capable of defending its industrial base without violating international law. Ultimately, this ripple effect redefines the social contract of manufacturing in North America. For too long, the narrative has been that globalization renders national borders irrelevant to capital. The GM crisis proves that borders still matter when a government has the courage to enforce them. We are witnessing is a return to the idea that a corporation's license to operate is contingent upon its contribution to the national welfare. As we watch Boeing study expansion options, or Intel consider new fabrication plants they are doing, so with a new variable in their calculus, the knowledge that in Canada, a promise is a legal currency, and defaulting on it carries a price that no shareholder wants to pay. If you are finding value in this analysis and want to stay updated on how this economic war unfolds, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring these hidden stories to light. Finally, this confrontation signals the beginning of a new era of economic sovereignty. As we look at the fallout of this crisis, it becomes clear that this moment is about far more than one factory in Ingersoll or one model of electric van. It is about a fundamental rewriting of power across a nation. For half a century, Canada operated under a quiet colonial assumption. The Americans are in charge. The assumption was that because the headquarters were in Detroit, the power was in Detroit. Canada was the backyard, a place to store things, a place to make things cheaply, but never a place that gave orders. The GM crisis of 2025 destroyed that assumption. It proved that Canada is not a client state. It is an independent economic force with its own leverage. Minister Mélanie Joly and the Canadian government demonstrated a new model of governance, one that moves from reactive appeasement to structural enforcement. The difference is profound. Appeasement is begging a company to stay by offering them money. Enforcement is setting clear rules and letting the company decide if they want to pay the price for breaking them. This new approach is not anti-business. In fact, it is deeply pro-business for the right kind of business. It rewards companies that invest, that build stable jobs, and that honor their contracts. It creates a predictable environment where the rules are clear. Corporations actually prefer strict rules to chaos. They just hate being the ones who have to follow them first. But the real victors in this story are the workers. For the first time in a generation, the people on the assembly line felt like their government was actually fighting for them. They saw that their labor had value, not just to the company, but to the country. When the government threatened to claw back subsidies, they were saying that taxpayer money, the workers' money, is not a free gift to foreign shareholders. The global implications are equally significant. Canada has sent a signal to every multinational corporation operating within its borders, from Boeing to Intel to the pharmaceutical giants. The message is simple. Access to the Canadian market is a privilege, not a right. It is conditional. If you want to sell to Canadians, you must respect Canadians. GM expected Canada to fold. They expected the polite response. Instead, they got the hammer. They triggered a chain reaction that exposed the fragility of their own power and the strength of a sovereign nation that finally decided to stand up. As the 15-day deadline approaches, the world is watching. If GM submits a plan, and all economic logic suggests they must, it will be a victory for the town of Ingersoll. But even if they don't, even if the tariffs remain, Canada has already won something more important than a factory. It has won back its self-respect. The era of the branch plant mentality is over. Canada is no longer anyone's backyard. It is a nation that has proven it can stare down a giant and make them blink. And for the workers of North America, that might be the most hopeful development in 50 years. Thank you.